Okay, here we are in Octane now. So that's my network here. It looks maybe confusing, but it's actually very simple, and I usually don't use very difficult shader setups. I'm more the drag and drop kind of guy. So, but with lots of materials, you kind of end up with something semi confusing at the end. And look at how messy this is. But we'll go through it, and you'll understand. It's pretty easy. So a couple of different parts to it, different blocks. So maybe zoom out one more time. This is for the actual architecture here on the left side. This thingy here is the people and the shaders for the people. That's some additional stuff I had to plug in later. And these are all the different shots. So for every different shot, I usually do a different, just copy and paste a render target, and then I can go here, and now it's going to take a bit of time to load because it is quite heavy. Let me make this a bit smaller here. So you see that's that shot, and then if I click on the next one, it has different settings, different camera. So I have a different shot, and you see it takes quite some time to resolve because there's a lot of shit going on. But to show the different aspects, maybe we'll take this shot. We can make it a bit smaller. So I need to find out what looks good and what you guys can see, and that we can still focus on my stuff down here. So these are all the different render targets, and I mean I'm usually using nothing special. I have my own kind of settings, and I think if you followed my previous tutorials, you kind of know what they are. So I like to play a lot around with the focal length. So here I'm using a 20mm lens. I want to have everything fairly sharp, so I chose an f-stop of 20. It's probably way too much. You can go to something like 11, is still fine, or 16. For some of the other shots, like I used maybe like a 2.8, a really fast lens, so the background is all blurred out. Other settings I use here, actually there's nothing else. I like to add a little bit of distortion, just to get a bit of real world feel, because no lens that you ever use is completely straight, and sometimes in let's see what it does. So it just adds like a tiny bit of lens distortion, and that makes it a bit more organic, makes it a bit more round, whatever. I mean, you play around with it. If you use higher values, it looks really strange, and so you kind of got to figure out what looks best and what just adds that tiny bit that does it for you. I use there's nothing in the background. I don't need like a daylight environment or anything. I don't really see the background at all, so I have just like a texture environment, set it to bluish tint to everything, but I very low power, so it's almost completely dark, because I want the illumination to come from artificial light sources predominantly, right? And if anything, yeah, I just want to have like a bluish tint to the image, and that's all. And then another basic thing that I have is I applied a medium, so I have like environment, like a uniform environment fog in there. The settings, again, you need to play around with it, right? So what creates this kind of fog is usually a mixture of the colors of the absorption and scattering. You can tint your environment in different ways. So if you really love pink, then of course this is inverted. This one, yeah, you can see how it becomes a different tint. It's blue again. These have all different, but it's not too strong, so I can ramp this up. So now you would see more of a tint, and you see how this creates very different kind of look. to the scene, but it's maybe a bit too much. So I don't want to have like a crazy amount in there. You play around with the density, which usually has to be really, really low, and the medium radius, which depending on how much fog you want and how big your scene is and how close and how far away objects are, you need to ramp that up a lot. But that's, I mean, I think this has been covered like so many times, so I don't want to go over it too much. In addition to this environment fog, the uniform one, I've added a localized fog. I'll get to that in a minute before I go here through the other settings. Resolution, I always like to have 239 by 1 kind of cinema scope. Aspect ratio, you can use whatever you want. I use the imager a lot, so I usually use a different kind of response curve here, kind of like a LUT color grading within it. You can use whatever you want. I mean, these do different things, and you need to use these in tandem with all the other settings of exposure and color and lights and everything. Use whatever you like, or don't use it at all. You can apply these later in Photoshop. I just kind of like to have a little bit of it in my renders. I use a lot of vignetting, which makes the corners darker. And the rest is pretty, I think I'll leave it standard. The post-processing is sometimes pretty nice, even if overused. Add that bloom, that glare a little bit. I feel like for at least for environment renders, it adds that little bit of realism. I make the glare ray amount to 190 degrees and blur it completely. Otherwise, you get these crazy. Let me see, can we see it? Otherwise, you get these crazy. No, you can't see it. You get these crazy glares, these like stars and stripes in it that you don't want to have it look like Star Trek. I mean, maybe you want it, but I'm not going for that right now. So you can add that or not add that. You can add it in Photoshop later. But for me, the thing is by adding these kind of things, it gives different results in camera, and it sometimes makes you go for choices that you would otherwise not consider. So that's why I do these in here, and maybe that gives me less control later, but again, it makes me do different choices here. So and these guys here all have sometimes slightly different settings. Let me look at something with a really, like you can see this image here has a really blurred out background. There's an f-stop of 4. And once you adjust this, you would actually get, like if you go for like 20, you see how the background is very sharp. If you go for 4, the background is blurred out. Here with the AF picker that you can activate here, you can choose where you want your sharp area to be, right? So that where everything is in focus, where you want that to be, right? The rest is out of focus. And you can adjust it. You can click on anything and it's going to change. So let's get back to this one. So here, as I said, I added something else, different objects. Like, but this is basically this line in the back here and this streak here. I felt like, you see now it's gone, but I can connect it again. What I wanted to have here is like something. I felt like I needed something against the to kind of not give it an end, but kind of have something to against the crowd of people. It was getting kind of too dark down here, so I added that one as additional illumination. I plug in a diffuse material with a texture emission, and then add an image that gives me like light information. Basically, the image is shooting the light out based on the image information. You can see that very well. Sorry, I do not know which one these are. Here you see. So that is the image here, and I can play with the power. So if you dial it down to 5, you can see the kind of like image it is. It has all these like light streaks in the back, and depending on, I enable surface brightness and then I play with the power, and then you can see how strong or light it's gonna be, right? So you can play around with that. So that is this part here, right? You can see, right, this part here. And here again is that fog. It's like it's a fog that is from Jama's tutorial. So please buy Jama's tutorial. It's really good. Octane one, any one of his anyway. I plug that into a placement node, which goes into our geometry group here. The geometry group is where everything comes together, where all the geometry comes together. So I have my scene in here. I have this one are the people, and here's anything additional. You can add input, and you can make this geometry group bigger and bigger and bigger, and add more stuff to it. And then I have this fog here. You have I'm setting a placement node. Placement, geometry, placement allows you to use these kind of things here. Now they don't show up because let me see if I can, maybe here. Here. So it gives you these handles to scale, rotate, or this gizmo here, and then you can move your stuff, right? You can use it with or without, but if you want to move this fog thing around, if you want to move it up, down, left, right, make it bigger, make it smaller, skew it, then you need this. Again, there's so many tutorials out there who do this. Don't think I need to go over it in detail. Again, it's a VDB file. There's plenty of them out there. You can buy them. You can buy my last tutorial with a spaceship. I had some VDB files included there to play around with. And then this messy thing here is basically the instancing around of all these people. I have a separate video of that where you can have a look how I built this. But basically, here is the geometry group, and here is our actual OBJ with the people and the umbrellas, the 4 people that we saw in the beginning. So what I've done is that I've added another group here. What that means is that I have used these 4 people here and made 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 instances of it. So I go out into a placement node. I go into this geometry group, which means I have 4 people here. And then I do these same 4 people and through another placement node. And I use this placement node to push these people around, move them to a different location, rotate them. And then I have here 8 people, and I have 12, 16, 20, 24, 28. So this geometry group contains 28 people. Right? And then because it's not enough to populate everything. I need more people. I need to generate them quicker. So now that I have these people with different placement nodes rotated in different directions or different orientations, whatever, I have this group of 28 people. And then I'm going to go out into this additional geometry group, and then I make another instance of this group of 28 people, and I go in here, and then I make another copy of 28 people, and another one. It's like 28, 56, and then here's 116, and then it goes on and on and on and on, right? And my math is pretty bad, so I can't add that up so quickly. But here I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, so 280. There are 280 people in this group here. And then I make not 1, but 2 of them. So I have 560 people on this scene, all with umbrellas. It was a crazy fire sale. I don't know. Because they all seem to be from the same manufacturer. I don't know. So you see I have these 2. I can copy large amounts a lot quicker. Instead of having like, if I was going to do like 280 people via these placement nodes, I'm going to go crazy. I will go crazy, right? So maybe there's more efficient ways of doing it, but I don't know. I'm sure somebody will message me again and tell me how it's done better, so I'm just waiting for that. Please tell me how to do it better, but that's the only way I know. So again, these 2 are all the people, and then here I have my OBJ. And then here simply these four are the people I mean these are 3D render people that I bought from some website, and they come with their own maps. So I have I add a glossy material. It comes with a color map, a specular map, and a normal map. Maybe overkill. So sometimes these come with like 16K textures for close-ups, but then, I mean, scale them down, use like 4K textures or 2K textures, because you see like a lot of them we won't even see up close, and it's just a waste of memory. And not that I'm the smartest person when it comes to using memory, but use it to the degree that works, right? For what your GPU is. Maybe you have one or you have two. I have two 1080 Ti that are running here, and this looks still pretty okay. And the good thing is that even though we have 560 people, the memory is still pretty efficient, because we're using instances instead of like copying these people. If I had 560 people times like 500,000 polys each, that is a shitload of geometry if I would have done it in Modo. So here we have the other materials. I have the glowing stick thing for the umbrella. I have a lot of stuff I use from the LiveDB, so I dragged in an aluminum for the metal parts of the umbrella. I have a plastic for the plastic parts. And here I have the cover, the plastic cover. So let's do the plastic cover first. I made a mixed material out of, excuse me, out of a specular. Here I'm using a raindrop file that I got from Zomax. Christoph Demmerich, extraordinaire 3D artist, get his raindrop displacement map. It's amazing. If you've been using it for years, plug it into the specular material here. It's visible in the close-ups. It's probably complete 32-bit overkill, but it holds up close really, really well, and it's amazing. I mix it with another specular material that has like a plasticky crease texture applied, so I get all these like shiny reflections of all the lights that I want. I plug it in together. I mix it. I invert that texture and mix it in the amount here, and I experimented a little bit, and it looks okay like that. There's probably easier or better ways to do that, but you know, I like a bit of experimentation, and whatever works for me. I'm not the best shader person probably to ask, but that's what I do. So here, in the glow stick thing, what I did here is that I didn't want to have the same color glow for every stick, even though now I do. But I couldn't go in and individually do all of these separately, right? Because they're instanced, and I didn't want to make a different material for every one of them. So I wanted to have a random distribution of colors, or even I wanted to have some have the glow stick, some don't have it, right? And that can be done randomly. So I did a diffuse material texture emission, but into that texture emission I plugged in a gradient, and into that, in the input texture, I put a random color texture node. So this one just has a seed here. I plug this into a gradient, and from the gradient I can assign different kinds of colors. You can add more of these little dots here, because in the beginning it will just have two, but you can add more by pressing plus or minus. So I experimented, and it looked a bit like Christmas tree craziness by having too many different colors. But you can add all of these. You can add different colors, and you can make your own kind of color ramp. And you can see here how now all these different geometries, all these different instances are getting populated with different kind of colors, exactly picked from the colors that I added here. And that looks pretty okay actually, but if you put everything and it's really colorful, then it looks completely crazy. So I didn't opt for that. And I didn't want to have it too like messy in terms of colors. So you see how you can add all of these colors, and then you can this random color texture will actually assign these randomly to all of these. It's pretty cool. You can do that for billboards or other stuff. Yeah, and that's how I did that one. Okay, so let's see. That's the OBJs with the people and the umbrellas. Next step, what do we have? Yeah, actually we're getting to the main thing. So look at that. That looks completely awful and unusable for anybody but me. So if you are a better node artist than me, then you probably make this a bit more a bit cleaner. I could clean it. You can here rearrange, and so it makes everything pretty. But often I have my own sense of things there. So on the one hand, I use a lot of pre-made materials. Again, the live database. Again, materials are not the most fantastic, but they're pretty good for the most part, right? And sometimes you just really need a basic aluminum, or you need a basic chrome, iron, or whatever. And then you plug that in, and then you can double click, and then you can dive deeper and change it to according to what you want. You can plug in different roughness maps or different projection types. But sometimes you just need standard stuff. And I have a lot of objects here, and some of them in the background, I really don't care about them, at least not for this scene. And so I tend to like, oh, this is some kind of like metal, this is another metal, one more metal, so I just use the same kind of metal material for all of them. And then I see what happens, and if it works, then I'll just plug in, I leave it plugged in. If it doesn't work, then I maybe replace exactly that node, because you see there's a shitload of nodes. Some of these are made, shitloads of inputs here. Some of them I made myself because I deliberately chose it and made it in a funky color in Modo, and so I can change it here. But some of these also came pre-made with, like, for example, the kitbash sets, and sometimes it doesn't make sense to go in and select everything separately and change it. So I left a lot of the maps from the kitbash sets, but then I can just plug in here something and see what happens here, and then I'll change it, right? So besides all these ones that I dragged and dropped from the live DB, which sits here, of course. Here's the live database, the online database of Otoy. I made also some myself. So some of the, again, I need to re-plug in some of the kitbash set stuff. So kitbash came with like some UV air conditioning images. So I plug those in so I get them correctly. All the emissions I kind of have to take care of myself. So again, there's like all the billboards that plug in. I use the same kind of like gradient random color texture, so I get a slightly different color billboard illumination around it. And then these signs have their own separate texture, and of course some of the windows, some of the neon signs, right? So those I needed to select separately. And because I have this diorama all around me, I get all these reflections on the umbrellas everywhere, which is of course pretty awesome. And I have the screens, and I use a mixture here. You see, I use materials with black body emissions, which just pump out whatever color you give it. There is texture emissions with images in them. So I mean, the same as before, I have it. I select emission texture, and then I plug in an actual image, and then I use the kind of projection I want, and then I crank up or crank down the power or the surface brightness I enable, and then I get images here. For example, on my screens I have now images of this lady here. And that's how you can illuminate using textures, so that you actually have a texture on the TV and it actually gives out a little bit of a glow. And that I've done like many times because I want to have different images here. Some of these I know I will replace later. I don't need to like be so finicky and like, oh shit, I need to like put like an image on every single one of them, like a different image. That becomes very, very time consuming, and it is maybe something still done quicker in Photoshop if you have a lot of these images. So again, a different kind of, I don't even know what this is anymore. Signage. Okay, there's some signage in there. It's probably this one here. And then we have, I need to look what these called. Yeah, for the ground, I have different kind of images. I usually use whatever fits. The only material that is a bit more complex and that I buy a lot of textures, right? So here I have a concrete floor because for some of the shots I wanted to go closer to the ground, so I wanted something that holds up. I kind of built this out of course, the textures that come supplied with it because these are really high quality. And then I usually, if I want to have it wet, I mix in a glossy material that is black and has some dirt texture in the roughness channel, and so I can control my reflections and it looks like a wet floor. Nothing special. It's very, very standard, but yeah, that's how it goes. So again, this looks intimidating. You just start at somewhere and then plug it in, and then you drag and drop a few more, and you plug in and plug in and plug in and plug in, and then eventually it's fully populated. And then you need to dial it in. Usually what I do is I start with my environment node and try to get the kind of feeling I want. So I make it really dark and then, excuse me, I make it really dark and then I add a few lights and then see how, add like here my few key light sources, and the rest doesn't really have any textures. So I can see how the image overall would look like with like the main things enabled, like the kind of environment lighting, and the kind of light sources that I have within the image. And then I can go from there, because the reflections and everything, they don't really make or break. I mean, they don't really they're not fundamental to the image. They are nice additional details and stuff and are necessary, but the overall scene is still established by the lighting. So you need to make sure that you start the lighting first, and then you go on to the materials. That's how I do it. And then we have pretty much, we went through everything. You see, these are really, really simple. It's just that I take like the glass shader and connect them to all the different glass, because in the end there's only like so many different materials in here. There are not that many. There's like some concrete, there's some tiles, there's some neon, there's some plastic, there's some metal, but overall that's pretty much it. And you shouldn't have, I think, too many different materials in a scene. It's going crazy otherwise. We can still change some of these here and there in Photoshop, and that's it, because I mean, we're not doing a final 3D here. So the last thing I wanted to just go through is like, I mean, we have done the camera, the materials, the environment, is the different passes. So you can enable these passes here. These are the passes we can save out later and use for compositing in Photoshop. Maybe you have some you like that I don't use, but I usually tend to have the beauty pass, of course, then the reflection pass, which looks like this. So all the reflections, it copies me. When I overlay this and put it into screen mode, which we are later going to see, is that it kind of gives me like a bump in brightness, and I can choose to add and delete these kind of highlights wherever I need them, whatever I want to accentuate. The volume gives me this, where the VDBs are the environment fog. So I can overlay that and I can make it really foggy, or I can add more depth to it. And it also has this nice grain. Of course, if you let it resolve longer, then it will have less grain, but I like a little bit of grain. I have Z depth applied here. You can see how that looks. And in the beginning it might look a bit funky, but then you can play around here with the slider to get exactly the kind of distribution you want, from dark to white, and you can see all the different separation of the background items, so we can overlay that in, I don't know, screen or soft light, and get more depth to the image. I also use material ID, which is akin to something like a clown pass, where you get every material gets a different ID attached, and then we can make quick selections in Photoshop based on those materials. Not the best way, but it's pretty useful. So we have that. Yeah, these are all the different passes, and then you just save them out separately as either 8-bit or 16-bit images, depending on how you like to work. For me, I think 8-bit has always been enough. So yeah, now we have, I made 14 different images. I don't think I'm going to use all of them, but so usually when I like one, I go copy paste, and then I have another one, and I change it. So I make sure I don't touch this one. And then I have this one, and I rotate the camera around, right? I try to find my shots that I like. I've done that previously in so many tutorials. So you move around. It's good to have an understanding of how cameras work, how focal length and f-stop work. You really should do some research if you want to dig deeper into 3D. And see, it's pretty funky colors we have now here, because I added different colors in my gradient, so they might look a bit different to the final renders I'm saving out. And yeah, so I'm trying to find interesting compositions, interesting pieces. A good mixture of foreground, background, midground. You can see that these images will take a while to resolve, because there's a lot of stuff going on, but it should not take more than maybe 10 minutes to get this in a decent resolution. Yeah, so that's about all I'm showing for my Octane setup for the scene. So now we're going into Photoshop and doing some last minute touch up, color grading, add some photo bash where we need, and then we're done.